¿Vos qué ves, Edith?
Lo mismo que vos. Lo actualicé y veo lo mismo.
No se ven, no se nos ven las caras, no.
Bueno, les cuento que están en vivo, hay 15 espectadores.
Nada. A ver, voy a entrar otra vez. No. Veo el chat que están entrando, pero no las caras de nosotros.
Por ahí dice esperando el hospital italiano.
Ah, sí, sí, dice esperando.
Sí, pero el delay nunca suele ser de tanto tiempo.
No.
Me voy a fijar. Por lo que me dice la página, ya estamos en vivo.
No, pero acá está el cartel nomás.
No, yo acabo de entrar desde el link que tengo y ya están en vivo. Hay 26 espectadores.
¿Me lo podés mandar, por favor, por mail? ¿Puede ser? O por
Sí.
WhatsApp, por donde quieras.
Ahí te lo envié, Sonia. Edith, no tengo tu celular, pero te lo envío por...
Si se lo mandás a Sole, ella me lo puede mandar.
Ok.
¿Me lo mandaste al celular?
Sí, Sonia, WhatsApp.
Bueno. Esto.
Yes, I will. I will speak very slowly and clearly. But I don't need 1 hour.
Ahora sí. Ahora sí.
Ahora sí.
Sole, ¿me puedes mandar el que es, por favor?
Te lo mando, Edith,
Dale.
pero vos qué querés, ¿por la computadora?
No, por WhatsApp puede ser, igual. Ahí me mandó Sole, me parece.
Ah, bueno.
No sé qué me mandó, a ver si vamos a intentarlo.
Te reenvío.
Mándame por WhatsApp, ¿puede ser?
Sí. Ya está.
Gracias. Bien.
Uy, tenemos gente de Brasil, de Mar del Plata, varios de Brasil, de Río Cuarto, de Bariloche, de Córdoba, de Uruguay. No te digo que me empiezan a pedir los links. Dice que por alguna razón me llegó un mail donde dice que la gente no está pudiendo entrar.
Sonia, yo te estoy viendo, pero entré por otro lado que dice reproducir webinars con los Sur.
¿Escuchaste, Gonzalo?
Sí, Sonia. ¿Me escuchás?
Sonia,
sí.
Yo te estoy viendo, pero entré por otro lado que dice reproducir webinars con los Sur.
Sí. Hay otra charla en este momento y por eso se está derivando, pero lo que estoy haciendo es mandar a todas las personas para este canal. Así que bien, si quieren vamos comenzando y las otras personas se van a ir sumando.
Perfecto.
¿Y no lo podemos poner acá, ahí en el chat, el link?
Le estoy derivando a las personas, así que no te preocupes que se van a ir sumando.
Bueno.
Bueno, empezamos. ¿Te parece, Sonia?
Y sí, empecemos y lo que pasa es que lamentablemente son muchísima gente y como no fueron entrando antes, bueno, se irán agregando, ¿sí? Dice, lo que pasa es que el enlace no te lleva directamente. Entre Ríos, ya está el link en el chat. Bueno, muy bien. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y a todas, a todes. Vamos a iniciar una charla, una conversación importante para nosotros con Judith Butler. Es un momento especial para todos nosotros porque acá en Argentina la leemos mucho, la escuchamos, la seguimos en su trayectoria, porque para nosotros es una pensadora, es lo que nos permite estar realmente poniendo en juego la complejidad que trajo todo el movimiento feminista, pero también la posibilidad de seguir pensando, interrogando, deshaciendo, como dice Judith, las categorías binarias, y para nosotros es un gran aporte la posibilidad de contar con ella hoy, ¿no? Bueno, voy a decir unas pequeñas palabras de presentación. Judith es doctora en filosofía de la Universidad de Yale en 1984, profesora en el Departamento de Literatura Comparada y Programa de Teoría y Clínica de la Universidad de California, Berkeley. Recibió el premio Andrews Mellon por sus aportes en el área de humanidades, el premio Adorno que otorga la ciudad de Frankfurt. Es doctora honoris causa por varias universidades, entre otras la Universidad de Buenos Aires, y ha realizado importantes aportes en el campo del feminismo, la teoría queer, la filosofía política y la ética, y autora de numerosos libros. Sabemos que el currículum dice datos, pero lo interesante es cómo ha marcado y ha afectado muchas de nuestras maneras de pensar y nuestras prácticas. Así que bueno, no sé si Edith, ¿querés decir algo ahora? O...
No, simplemente saludar, agradecer y nada, es un enorme placer la posibilidad de acercar la conferencia de Judith a muchos colegas de la República Argentina y de otros lugares de Latinoamérica que nos están acompañando. Así que le cedo la palabra y en todo caso después retomamos. Dijiste todo lo que podía decir, Sonia, así que está muy bien eso. Escuchamos a Judith, ¿sí? No sé si nosotros tenemos que aclarar algo de la traducción y eso, Sonia, o no.
No, la traducción va a ser a través de subtítulos y seguramente ya lo están diciendo, ¿no? Ok.
Bien.
Well, thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí con vosotros. Today I will speak on a question that many people ask: how to live now. So how to live now. Regardless of where we are, and we are many places, we live now under a new condition or conditions created by the pandemic. Some of us are doubtless suffering losses, and others watching from a safer part of the world, but all of us are living in relation to ambient or proximate illness and death. However differently we register this pandemic, we doubtless understand it as global. It implicates us in a world of living creatures whose capacity to affect one another can be a life or death matter. Sorry. I am not sure I would say that this is a common world we share, since many of the resources of the world are not precisely shared. And there are those who understand themselves to have no share of the world. That makes a difference in how we register what is happening. Perhaps there is a singular world, and then there are many worlds that are not quite part of that world, in contact, or perhaps they are in contact with one another or overlapping, or perhaps there is an undercommons, to cite Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, servicing that one world but distinct from it. If we do talk about a single world, a shared world, we might have to talk about shares of the world, since the world is not shared equitably, and sometimes we rightly say that the world belongs to some people at the expense of others. A large portion of pain is clustered in some parts of the subjugated and colonized world and in communities of color. In the United States, Black and brown people are 3 times as likely to become infected with the virus as white people, and twice as likely to die. What kind of world is it in which those statistics are true? What version of truth do those statistics serve? And what world is circumscribed by the statistics themselves? Even as social and economic inequalities are brought into fuller relief, under pandemic conditions, a common immunological predicament has emerged, one that we live out, one that we experience very differently. Pandemic, pandemia, is etymologically pandemos, all the people, or perhaps more precisely, the people everywhere. A pandemic operates throughout the population, but it also afflicts the people as the world that is implied is everywhere. The pan Hmm. A world that is threaded together through infection and recovery, by immunity and by fatality. There is no border that stops the virus from traveling if humans travel, and no social category secures anyone absolute immunity. The world is treated as if it were a singular horizon, even though, in other contexts, we surely talk about worlds in the plural. We don't generally hear about worlds of the virus. If we did, that would suggest that multiple world horizons are operative, horizons that do not exactly fuse, that may be asynchronous, and that only another term, like the planetary, can provide a horizon predicated upon a critical perspective on geographical maps that are invariably geopolitical, whose lines are the accomplishments of those who vanquish national boundaries, usually forged through war or colonization. The planetary does not necessarily take the human as its presumptive center. Both Ashil Mbembe and Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak have suggested versions of this view, which are well worth considering as we rethink radically the maps of the world in light of the virus. My admittedly more narrow point today concerns a different sense of pandemic world. My suggestion will be that no matter how located and differentiated the pandemic registers for us, it is a phenomenon, a force, a crisis, or perhaps a condition that extends throughout the world, and that in being treated as a condition of the world, it figures the world in some quite specific ways. At first, that will seem a bit off, a bit strange, since it is humans who pass this virus to one another, as well as some animals in the early stages. I will return to the human and the animal, including social inequality, but I'm wondering whether we can do that in a more illuminating way by focusing first on this phenomenon that we call the world. Although some regions seem to have escaped the coronavirus, and some have contained its effect through impressive forms of social conduct, no region is in principle immune. I still live in a state where the virus is sometimes increasing, and shelter in place is the reigning public health regulation. A pandemic names a global susceptibility, a potential suffering that belongs to human life in its immunological relationship to the world, one that is part of the world for now, but probably not for all time. This pandemic may well fade, but the immunological vulnerability will certainly not. And what this means is that what is foreign or exogenous is always part of any organism, a position defended by co-constructionists for many years, including Thomas Pradue. Their thesis is that the organism is constructed by its environment, even as it constructs that environment in return. But the point is less to distinguish what belongs to the self and what does not than to reformulate the way we think about the body in its immunological relationship to its world. The problem with the virus is not that it is foreign, that it comes from a foreign country. The problem with the virus is that it is new, that it is unprecedented, that our organisms have no way yet to respond to it, to fight it, with immunological resources. So those who use xenophobia to think about the virus, right, calling it the virus from Wuhan or whatever, this is not right. The problem with the virus is not that it's foreign. We have many foreign things in our bodies. We depend on foreign things coming into our body like food. The problem is that it's unprecedented, that we must learn how to fight this, or we must get a vaccine or other kinds of medications and immunologically strengthening practices to fight the virus. What strikes me is how often I hear a question uttered in anguish or in surprise. What kind of world is this in which such a thing can happen? What kind of world is this in which a pandemic like this can close everything down, change our lives, change our relationship to each other, to the air, to the surfaces of the world, to where we go and whether we can go anywhere at all? I would suggest that the question, what kind of world is this, is a question about the world in which such a virus can happen. It is not an altogether new idea of the world, since pandemics have happened before, and yet it is new, since this pandemic has not happened before. Something about the pandemic makes us take the world as our object of scrutiny. Something about the pandemic registers the world as a cause for alarm. Understand the world as a suddenly opaque condition and the limit of existence as we know it. Even though in such instances we are asking about the world, taking the world as our object, the world the virus touches and unevenly permeates, the world is not only a map or a picture, but something exhibited in the course of viral circulation and its effects. We may be given graphic pictures of the virus with its blue crown and spikes. Of course, in Spanish, it's corona. It's like, why is it corona? Because it looks like a crown? Maybe. But these representations, they fill our screens. They stand for, they represent a viral condition that they cannot represent. They are an abbreviation, a visual abbreviation for a viral condition that cannot be adequately represented. They are closer to the logo of the virus or an advertisement for Disney World. They are abbreviated graphic forms that still the virus and splash it with color. And though some of the daily graphs and maps which seek to produce a picture of the viral world are surely useful, I am not sure we thereby get the picture of the virus or of the world that its pandemic character implies. You may remember that Heidegger claimed that the world picture does not mean a picture of the world, but the world conceived and grasped as a picture. He raised questions about whether the world could or should be conceived that way. He pointed out that the subject who stands before such a world picture seeks not only to grasp that visual version of the world in its entirety, but finds itself exempt from the world it seeks to know, absent from the world it seeks to know. Sometimes we find that conceit, that figure, excuse me, in the media, and it consoles us by presuming that we are not part of the picture we see. Today, however, I am wondering in a tentative way whether the viral world or the sense of the world given by the virus is one that pertains to touch and to breathing, to proximity and distance as it works its invisible ways. Part of what makes it frightening is that we cannot see the virus in everyday life without a rather powerful technological instrument. For that reason, I am drawn back to phenomenology, or perhaps compelled to draw phenomenology forward in order to understand the phenomenon as exhibiting a sense of world, or a world that is given to us in part through the senses, not just sight, but touch and breath and 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 all the other senses as well. What are those senses? Well, one is touch, the haptic sense. The other I want to call breath, the air we take and give, that we also share. Another has to do with the complex surfaces and enclosures of the world, the infrastructures of habitation. I am hardly saying anything new when I note that the world of surfaces and the air we breathe should function, ideally, as supports for life. And that under pandemic conditions, we come to worry about touch, about breath, about proximity, about loud shouts of joy, dancing too closely, singing too loudly. This is a kind of perpetual sorrow that afflicts all the joints of sociality. We have bad air in California, so this is why I'm coughing. I'm perfectly healthy. Do not worry. How do we live in a world under such conditions? How to reflect now on the conditions of a livable life? It is as if the basic requirements for life have been laid bare, and that we become aware of the easier ways of touching and breathing that we perhaps had before, the ease with which we hugged or came close, besos, big, intimate relation with close friends, lovers, colleagues. For many of us, we have lost the kinds of proximity that we valued. We lose touch, tactility, proximity, and connection, or we feel its attenuation. We recede into boundaries, if we have them, if we have shelters, of selfhood and space, of shelter and household, of neighborhood paths, as the value of extra-domestic intimacy and sociality is attenuated or lost, as we, as it were, lose touch with one another across the enforced distances. Of course, for each of us, it is always this or that loved person or this or that gathering that we surely miss. But it is also the constriction of the horizon that delimits what we call the world. So perhaps the problem is not only the world in which such a viral threat and destruction is possible, has become actual. The problem is also how to pose and dwell with the question of life. What does it mean to live as a living creature, a creature among creatures, a life among living processes under conditions such as these? The restrictions under which we live now have proven to be occasions for new experimentations, communities of care that are not bound by households, that establish kin beyond the usual turns. But also, in some places, there is the sense that a partially stopped economy has given the environment a chance to renew and repair. I see this is not the case in Brazil, right, where the destruction continues to happen. Strangers can treat each other not only with paranoia, but also with remarkable solicitude, at least in the streets that I know. Social movements like Black Lives Matter take to the streets in masks and apparently act in responsible enough ways so that no spikes in the virus are traced to those impressive and unstoppable movements for social and economic justice. The case for national health care, which we need in the United States because we are a backward country, you must forgive us. Don't forgive us, I take that back. The case for national health care has never seemed stronger. The case for a guaranteed national income is now more possible than before. And the movements to abolish prisons and defund the police are no longer crazy ideas. They're no longer impossible pipe dreams, but they are openly debated in public life. And there is also some form of grief and solidarity that cross the social and economic lines that so often tend to separate human creatures from one another. Those who deny the death, the loss, the stunning forms of economic and social inequality may well be in the course of losing power. So the pandemic condition also links us. It establishes our ties as both precarious and persistent. It establishes our ties of solidarity in order to fight for new economic justice, new forms of social equality, healthcare, and to oppose forms of violence that very often affect women who are doing domestic work and trans people who are stigmatized by health and police authorities. So if we ask the question, how to live now, the answer seems to be found in an altered relation to the environment and to society. We keep our distance out of love and out of a commitment to another's life, any number of other lives, the ones we know, the ones we do not know. We keep our distance in order to stay connected, to affirm the social and connected character of ourselves and our lives. For if the air I breathe is the air you breathe, and if we share the surfaces of the world, then one never lives solely for oneself, because one is not one. One is not one. One is multiple. One is many. One is an indefinite number of others who are also connected to this self, defining, supporting this self's life. There is, in fact, no living self without a social and economic world organized in such a way that it sustains life. And there is no future without an economy and a healthcare system that is dedicated to providing equitable and affordable care for the living and protections against violence. We do not just live next to one another, close to one another, in proximity. We are quite literally living in the hands of the other. We live in each other's breath and breathing. So it's not just at the moment of birth that we are, as it were, in the hands of another, but throughout life, We are dependent on each other. We are social creatures. And that is why shelter, food, and health are what we are ethically bound to give one another. That is the basis of the demand for social justice, for persistence, and for justice alike. Thank you very much. I believe we have a discussion or some comments.
¿Sí? Bueno, me parece muy importante lo siguiente. Hay posibilidades y hay dificultades. Luego de, no sé si tengo el micrófono, tuvimos los subtítulos que tuvimos, vamos a mandar un trabajo traducido, pero me parece que Judith dijo unas cuantas cosas de las cuales se puede comentar y preguntar algunas cosas. La verdad es que es preferible la creatividad posible que la queja. Yo creo que hacemos y se hizo todo lo que se pudo y pudimos tener esta transmisión y pudimos escuchar muchas de las cosas que dijo Judith que nos hacen pensar, más allá de no haber tenido literal la situación. Entonces aprovechemos lo posible y entonces tratemos de transmitirle alguna cuestión de las que están apareciendo, ¿no? Por ejemplo, esta cuestión de qué piensa del aumento, supuestamente aumento, de femicidios que se han observado en estos tiempos pandémicos. Esa es una pregunta que hay, ¿no? Me parece que otra pregunta es, perdón, es interesante la idea de cómo ha sido golpeado. Que es interesante la idea de cómo ha sido golpeado el autocentrismo y cómo ahora nos cae la idea de que somos simplemente una criatura entre otros. Bueno, me gustaría transmitirle algunas cosas más y van comentando. Cómo batallar contra el capitalismo que tiene la responsabilidad de lo que no teníamos en vista, de lo que no acontecía, o lo que no, yo pondría lo que estaba como invisibilizado hasta que llegó esta pandemia, ¿no? Y si podría profundizar algo de esta idea de comunidades del cuidado.
Yes.
Bueno, podría seguir, pero si querés podés ir contestando un poquito de esto, ¿no?
Ok, es suficiente.
Bueno.
Okay, well, first of all, as we know, the public regulations to stay in the home assume, first of all, that people have a home. And not everybody has a home. So it imagines, the regulations, we could say, imagines a world in which there is no homelessness, right? And when there are provisions made for the homeless, they are very often quite terrible because people are, and this is true in several countries, people are pushed into situations living close together where they cannot safely distance from one another. This is also true with prisons. This is true with the hideous detention centers that are created for migrants in Europe and in the United States and in other countries whose northern borders are very often rimmed with detention centers. Okay, so certain populations are being regulated and exposed to danger rather than protected. They might be separated from the larger public society for the safety of public society, but they are themselves put in situations of extreme danger. So I've mentioned the home, I've mentioned detention centers and prisons, all of which are places where maintaining physical distance is very difficult. But in the home as well, as we know, uh, domestic battery has increased. The beating of women, the battery of women, and the killing of women. Um, and and I believe that this being locked into the home without the ability to go to a shelter, without the ability to make use of a network that can get you out, can bring you into a safe space, has been absolutely terrible for many women. So it is not surprising that being locked in the home is not safety, it is endangerment for some people. And I also want to include queer kids, right? Gender nonconforming kids, kids who disagree with the politics of their parents, kids who are trying to understand and find their sexuality. They have no privacy, they have no place to go. Their lives are exposed to parents who may very well be violent or so religiously rigid that they will expel their children or beat their children. So this is also, for me, a huge question. What about trans and queer youth under conditions of lockdown? Okay, so that's maybe the negative side, the horror that we must look at and understand. On the other hand, I see social movements and I see neighborhood movements, I see community movements which have produced mutual aid societies, uh, networks of care, people who, in safe ways, provide housing, mobility for others who are trapped inside situations. I see lawyers working all day long, trying to get people out of prison. They have a new argument. The prison is is mm, is now changing the sentence. And I see this right here in California, not far from where I live, where people who are put away for 3 years or 5 years for some reason, they are now having a death sentence, right? No court of law said you will be punished by death, but keeping them in the prison is increasing the probability of punishment by death, especially for those who are older or who have pre-existing conditions or who have never had access to proper health care because they've been discriminated by the healthcare against by the healthcare system. Okay, so but there are these networks that are working. They may not be gathering in the street. Sometimes they are, in a careful way. I've seen the street be very effective. But they are working to produce networks of care that are not just the nuclear heteronormative family, right? And unfortunately, right, when a regulation says everyone go home, everyone go back home, home is safety. How is home being imagined by the regulation or by those who make that regulation? Home as safety. Oh, well, mine is, but I had to fight to have this. I had to fight legally to have this home. I had to fight legally for my child who doesn't live here, but I had to fight legally to be able to live together with my woman partner. Many of us had to fight for homes to which we were not entitled for many years. But look, many people experience home as danger. They experience street as less dangerous. They experience public life as the least dangerous, or they leave the home and one kind of violence in order to confront a different kind of violence on the street. So, you know, this is a very complicated question, but I see that the forms of community that are being produced that open up the heteronormative family, that allow for passage out of its closed domain, uh, um, obviously promote freedom and safety, and passion and desire and life in ways that are absolutely necessary now. So we are, I think, entering into forms of community that are supporting life, supporting the life of living creatures. I think we are also seeing that national boundaries are not only artificial but dangerous. And we see this now, of course, with the debates that are happening about different countries making deals with big pharmacological industries. You know, our president, sorry, I cannot speak his name because then I will become sick and I can't finish this event. Okay, so we won't speak his name. Our president makes a deal only for Americans, only for US citizens, right? He doesn't understand that so many people are Americans. Only for US citizens will this drug be available, right? So when international cooperation is destroyed and nationalism and self-interest become the values that are guiding the search for the vaccine, then we see in new form first world, third world distinctions, first world, second world. We see nationalist distinctions among the so-called first world, not the French, just the US. So this is a chance to struggle for international collaboration, and I see scientists involved in that struggle. I see scientists involved in social justice struggles. Many of the women who are the leading scientists in Germany are struggling for a framework of equal distribution where those most in need would get the vaccine first, no matter where they live globally. And there is no other way to think about justice. It should always be the case that those who are most in need, no matter who they are, no matter where they live, would get the vaccine first, or some other antiviral medication that would be effective. So I think as well, we're seeing a renewal of radical environmentalism. The world is watching as Bolsonaro destroys the Amazon and destroys the lands of the indigenous and denies their rights and destroys biodiversity throughout Brazil with his monstrous form of capitalist greed. I think we are also seeing a new form of anti-capitalism and the renewal of socialist ideals, right? And when we talk about the renewal of socialist ideals, we're not necessarily thinking of this socialist state or this socialist state. There's a rethinking of socialism. What is it for now? What would it be now? What would a socialism be that fought continuing colonization, the destruction of indigenous life and habitat and world, the destruction of the environment? What would a socialist ideal be that put women and trans and LGBTQI people first or front, so that their rights to live in their bodies and with their passions would be absolutely central to any left vision? I think that I see that as well, and I saw it certainly in the Black Lives Matter movement here in Northern California, in Oakland, which I can see from my window. And And that was beautiful because there were people feeding each other. There were people offering shelter. There were people saying, I will take you to the hospital, and here's somebody who will pick you up. And this is what we need to do to stay safe. And here's your water, and here's your vegetables for the week. And this kind of community action, it's it's not really organized by capitalism. It's actually organized by principles of community care. And let me just say lastly that we have to understand ourselves as creatures, living creatures, in order to assume responsibility for this planet so that we do not destroy this planet. But also, we are connected to other humans and to animals and to living forms of life that that make us not only part of the environment, but um, but make us smaller, make us smaller as human beings, and make our own self-interest into something that makes no sense if it does not take into account the interest of everyone and the interest of the planet itself. So I think that the model of self-sufficiency, the model of self-interest, which is deeply masculinist but also deeply capitalist, is being deconstructed in ordinary life without the language, without the texts, right? You don't need to read a text on deconstruction to deconstruct individual self-interest. You need to know that you can be infected and others can be infected, and you're in a common predicament. You live in a common world. That if my air becomes impossible to breathe, so does everyone else's. And even though I might experience it as my asthma or my problem, I know that it is others as well, and that this is a common condition, one for which we take common responsibility.
Hay muchas preguntas, Sonia.
Sí. No estoy no estoy escuchando la traducción. ¿Me escuchan a mí?
Sí, te escuchamos, Sonia.
Bueno, si piensa que va a haber algunos efectos en los cuerpos relacionados con esta pandemia, no solo los cuerpos enfermos, sino los cuerpos en estado de diversidad de este momento, y si esto va a tener si le parece que puede tener algunos efectos particulares, ¿no? También hay una pregunta relacionada con la vulnerabilidad inmunológica y la vulnerabilidad social, ¿no? Hay algunas preguntas interesantes relacionadas con cómo piensa la división, la distribución de tierras. Bueno, acá en Argentina ha habido todo un episodio muy fuerte con la toma de tierras, ¿no? Y surgieron acá innumerables opiniones diversas, desde decir que la propiedad privada es sagrada, hasta otras ideas acerca de que es importante que se distribuya la tierra para los que están sin techo y para que no tienen hogar ni dónde habitarla. Y hay algunos terratenientes que tienen miles y miles de hectáreas sin uso, sin cultivo o un cultivo temporario, y entonces cómo hacer otra distribución. Estas dos opiniones tan absolutamente segregantes, ¿no? Entre ellas. Por eso me pareció que había muchas cuestiones sobre la Tierra, no solamente el planeta a cuidar, sino el efecto de este capitalismo y neoliberalismo despiadado, ¿no? Y también algo relacionado lo que está sucediendo con los medios masivos de comunicación y los efectos que esto está teniendo en las poblaciones, ¿no? Edith, ¿querés leer alguna más?
No, pensaba en esto donde sí, en esto de los medios de comunicación, pensaba más allá de que no esté en una pregunta donde particularmente en América Latina aparece más una lógica de mercado que estos ideales de cómo cuidar al otro desde los medios de comunicación y producen efectos en la producción de subjetividad en general en la sociedad. Y pensaba también en esto que planteaba de la dificultad del distanciamiento social en algunos territorios que nosotros tenemos en América Latina, de conglomerados de población, de estos que están sin tierra y que no hay espacio para el distanciamiento social, porque, digamos, son territorios que aquí se llaman villas, ¿sí? En Brasil, favelas, donde no hay hacinamiento y hay falta de derechos y vulneración de derechos. Por eso me parece interesante esto de cómo pensar aquí, ¿sí? Las vidas negras importan, mientras que en algunos casos aparecen en nuestros países algunos levantamientos de ciudadanos donde la vida del otro no importa, lamentablemente, ¿no? ¿Cómo pensarlo?
Acá también surgió una idea de que a la vez que surgen redes de cuidados comunitarios, emergen formas violentas de individualismo o desde los sectores de privilegio, ¿no?
Uh-huh.
No sé si quieres hacer un comentario o escuchar un poco más.
Está con el micrófono apagado, Judith.
Sí.
Oh.
Perdón. Demasiado, ¿no?
Demasiado. Estos son los últimos, Judith.
No, es muy bien. Las preguntas son muy bien. I mean, it is a question about how the life of the body or our bodies together will change in the course of the pandemic and after the pandemic. It's not bad for women to have someone say, "Am I too close to you?" Right? Or for a woman to say, "You're too close to me." Like, boundary over there. And that is a good practice. And it's a good practice not just for the virus, but hey, I want you close. You will get an invitation to be close. You don't get to be close to me without an invitation. This is an important principle. If we learn something about the gift of an invitation to be close, and that it is a gift, it is not a privilege, it is not a power, it is not a presumption, it is a gift. If it is given, beautiful. If it is not, no. So there is this. So I am interested in that. Of course, we also know that's happening at the same time that there is domestic abuse and violence and murder. So those boundaries are not always respected, but boundaries are interesting. Boundaries are ways of being connected, and they're also ways of being separated, and we negotiate at the boundaries of our body. So some more careful negotiations, I think, is not bad. I don't know. We will have to all learn to be sexual again in a different way. We will, for people who are looking for lovers, or I mean, this search is very very difficult right now. Perhaps more testing, perhaps more experiments. I test, you test, we all take a break. You know, this we can learn from the HIV communities who also had to figure out how to protect and also pursue a life of pleasure and intimacy. I do think that we see our bodies as more connected, that what is inside and outside are constantly moving in and out, that we are not just bounded, but we are connected, and in ways we don't like and in ways we very much do like. Um, I I think immunological vulnerability is extremely interesting to think about. It is, you know, I believe you have the same word in English. We say susceptibility. You know, you're susceptible to the virus. Um, uh, you are vulnerable in the sense that you could catch it. And this susceptibility, this is not something we can destroy. This is not something we can pretend does not exist. We are always susceptible. It's part of what it is to be a body in the world, living with other people and with animals both. We are susceptible. They can pass things to us. We can pass things to them. And these forms of passage are ways in which we now have to think about the body if we did not already. Um, Immunological vulnerability is important. There's a distinction, though, that some people fail to make. Like, if I say people who are living in the favelas or the bichos or in areas of dense population, if I say those people are more susceptible to getting the virus, I'm not saying something about them is weak or susceptible and that other people who are living some are not susceptible. I'm saying that this is a socially organized susceptibility. It is a susceptibility by virtue of how shelter is distributed, how property is distributed, about who has the money to buy property or to live inside their own enclosed space and who does not have that money. So this idea of immunological susceptibility intersects with social inequality and land distribution and property distribution and the institution of private property. So we need to think of that. And also people who live in very polluted cities or areas where the air is bad, they are also more susceptible, not to catching it, but more susceptible to experiencing a more serious, grave, damaging version of the virus because their immunological system is already suppressed. And it's suppressed not because that's the way they are. Oh, they happen to have a suppressed immune system. No, that immune system has been suppressed by the toxins in the air. It has been, and very often it is a suppressed immune system is the result of environmental racism or lack of shelter or a policy of private property itself. So we need to be able to think immunological susceptibility and vulnerability in relationship to these social powers. I mean, I think I don't want to comment too much on politics in Argentina when I don't know the details, but I do know people have been involved in a long-standing struggle for land distribution, especially it's especially important in relationship to the the land rights of the indigenous people and the rights to housing on the part of all those who left the agricultural portions of the city and came, or of the country, and came into cities to find that they could not afford to live in apartments or in houses. And so I did at one point follow the squatters, the squatters who took over buildings and laid claim to the right to have those buildings. And I believe that land distribution is extremely important in order to achieve equality, to protect sacred lands and indigenous lands, and to make sure that shelter, safe shelter, is a right for everyone, right? Every country should be committed to that right. And how do you achieve it? You don't achieve it through a system of private property where only the rich are sheltered and the very poor are not sheltered or poorly sheltered. So I do think a critique of private property is extremely important. And I also think that we should perhaps consult indigenous forms of knowledge to think about the land and the land-human relationship, the relationship of land and history, and what of those histories have been destroyed and what of those lands have been destroyed. I also want to say something about market rationality and the production of the subject in line with market rationality. I do think that under neoliberalism, that new forms of individuality have been produced. They are, to some degree, an extension of classical liberal individualism, self-interested, right to own property, here, right to bear arms, right to increase wealth without limit. But under neoliberalism, we have a slightly different version. First of all, we are told we must enhance our human capital, like our value in some market sense that is not quite the same as our profit or our ability to make profit. And then that raises the question, well, who has value and who does not? Whose lives matter and whose lives do not? What calculation is being made about who has value and who does not? But also, we're told that individuals should take responsibility for their education, their housing, their health care, and their food supply, even when they are living in a room that denies them housing, makes it unaffordable or inaccessible, or denies them proper health care, or makes it impossible to lay claim to shelter, much less property. So this, of course, is a way of driving people somewhat crazy, right? You're responsible for your life, and yet we undermine, through social policy, everything that could help you to live your life. And I think we need to reject the neoliberal idea of responsibility. If we have obligations, which is the word I prefer to use, it would certainly be to each other to make sure food and shelter is provided and that violence against those who are vulnerable comes to an end, and that we fight to bring that to an end. We fight in a nonviolent way. I think that there are ways of deciding whose life matters and whose life does not matter. I see, for instance, in industries that fear the loss of profit under the pandemic, they push their workers to work in crammed spaces, especially in food industries, and their workers get sick and fall ill. But because unemployment rates are high, they know there's a new set of workers who can come in. So they replace those workers. This one's sick, this one died, fine. We can replace them very quickly. This is old style capitalism. This is the capitalism that Marx wrote about when he wrote about industrial exploitation and injury in Britain as he was writing Capital. So that is still there, but there's also, of course, forms of racial and gender stratification of deciding whose life matters, whose life should be safeguarded, and whose life is dispensable. So these are calculations. I would even say there may be permutations of market rationality that decide on whose life has value and whose life does not have value. And of course, I have seen people, even in the fires here, people who guard their property with guns, who don't open their doors to those who are fleeing fire. They guard their property with guns. And this kind of violent right to property is, of course, the destruction of community and the destruction of equality and a threat to life itself.
No.
Oh, and there was a question about mass media. I don't know. I mean, at this point, I think social media is our friend and our enemy. And I don't know what to make of that. I think we also need to use our networks in order to communicate knowledge that is not communicated by major news agencies, and we need to also fight against government control over news agencies. I see that is happening in my country. It happens in many other countries where people are fired or news agencies have to close because they are critical of the government. Critique, open dissent, open discussion of public policy has to be part of what news does. But mass media is, it's driven by capital and it's regulated by government, so it has to be disarticulated from both of those powers in order to be able to remain critical of those powers. I think that's all I have to say there.
Sí, acá hay algo que me pareció, perdón.
¿Qué ibas a decir, Sonia?
No escuchaba lo que porque era un delay. No, que iba a decir que acá hay un comentario que me pareció interesante, que evidentemente ante esta circunstancia, además de no poder salir a la calle, usar el espacio público relacionado con los contagios, etcétera, como que habría que inventar nuevas formas de resistencia, ¿no? Porque ya también con la calle hay algo paradójico de que por un lado la calle es donde se sale a poner en juego la protesta, la crítica, la marcha, pero por el otro lado, paradójicamente, habría que tratar de evitarlo por las situaciones de contagio. Entonces, como que sería que habría que inventar nuevas formas de resistencia para seguir cuidándonos, digamos, ¿no?
Sí, hay una pregunta muy compleja de cómo componer nuevas formas de cuidado y organización comunitaria, cómo hacer que la vida sea una vida vivible para todos, al aire respirable y la tierra habitable a partir de esa descomposición. Dificilísimo de contestar, me parece.
Hay una recomendación, que no sé si lo conoces o no, un texto que se llama Teoría de la Mujer Enferma, de Johanna Hedva, que desarrolla preguntas sobre el cuidado y el encierro y el riesgo, ¿no? Bueno, alguien que lo menciona. Y después acá también preguntaron qué papel tiene el Estado frente al reclamo de la distribución de la riqueza, y hasta cómo se podría definir de alguna otra manera la propiedad privada y lo público, ¿no? Bueno, esto, como aquí en Uruguay dice, las villas, las favelas se llaman cantegril. Llaman cantegril. Dice, si hay capitalismo de Estado en Rusia, India y China, ¿cómo pensar un mundo más socialista? Bueno, no sé si alguno, Edith, si querés tomar algún otro comentario.
Me parece que son muchos, ¿no? Como para darle la palabra a Judith.
Uh-huh.
Todas cuestiones bastante complejas para...
Yes.
Por ejemplo, preguntan, ¿qué formas puede tomar lo comunitario para que se traduzcan derechos nuevos o viejos, pero que sean efectivos?
Well, some of these questions would involve my writing a new lecture. So if you want me to do that, I will do that. But I have to come back another time then. There are many good questions. Thank you. And thank you for listening to me. Maybe I can give some brief answers. I think there are ways of still going to the street. I think Ni Una Menos still knows how to work the street, to be careful, to keep the distance on the street, but still cover the street. And I've seen this in many demonstrations. So I don't think we have to give up on demonstrations under the pandemic. Black Lives Matter, incredible, and people were safe. Masks, distance, beautiful, very beautiful. But here is what I think. Demonstrations and street assemblies are very important. I've written about them. I applaud them. They are not the only way of mobilizing. I think communities of care are extremely important. They are under the radar. I mean, you don't necessarily see when that's happening, but they do. It does happen. But further, communities of care are not just local communities, right? The trans-regional communication of knowledge, the trans-regional, trans-linguistic effort to mobilize politically is happening through social media, through these platforms. We are in some sense more connected than we were before, right? So I think that these are also networks of care, and that we can think about care not just as what mothers do, we can think about care and not just what communities offer. We can think about care as a principle for a global approach to healthcare, to housing, to questions of equality and well-being. And I'm not like, oh, care is everything. No, I don't think care is everything, but without care, there is nothing. So it's an extremely important, it's extremely important. I know that there's a critique of care, it's very Christian, maybe. I think there are different versions of care coming from different secular religious traditions. We don't have to accept one particular religious version. nor should we be opposed just because aversion is religious. I don't have that opposition. So I think that that's extremely important. I think health justice has to be a concept so that we can think about the principles that organize society. Who gets care, who does not, who gets good care, who is abused or discriminated against by the healthcare system. And once we start talking about health justice, then we also are talking about who is part of the healthcare system and where is it? Where is it located? Is it located in communities? Is it located in the places where people can easily travel? Is it accessible? Is it affordable? Is it welcoming? Is it welcoming? For people who want to know if they walk through the door, they will not face discrimination. So I think that these are really important questions. You know, if we hold property in common, if we think about common property, or maybe we don't use the term property, we think about a common world or a common environment that's held in common, then I think we have a different idea of what it is to be an individual. We are people who share the world. And I think as well that we have a different relationship to housing. It is not my property as opposed to yours. It's not my property that I earned by virtue of my wage. It is property or place, maybe, not property, but place that becomes mine by virtue of my belonging to a world, and that belonging being recognized as a common good. So I do believe that although the pandemic is very hard, we suffer loss, sorrow, anxiety, loneliness. We also are in the middle of reimagining our world, and that it is a moment to have these conversations across continents and languages in order to rethink the principles by which we live, the ones that would make life more livable for everyone. And that means rethinking equality and rethinking life. And rethinking justice. These are our tasks. And we need to stay connected so that we make sure we understand this as a global project rather than an imperialist imposition or an unthinking concept that comes from somewhere else. Anyway, I think that I've come to the end of my time, so I'm sorry I wasn't able to answer all your questions perfectly, but I very much appreciate your invitation. Thank you, Sonia and Edith, and for everyone else who helped with the translation, beautiful translation. Gonzalo, Francisco, Melissa, Gio, everyone. I feel very happy to be there. I am sorry I cannot go out with you for a beautiful meal in Argentina. I love eating meals in Argentina. Anyway, I'm thinking of you, and I thank you so much for this invitation.
Ya te vamos a invitar, a comer asado, champán, vino de distintas regiones del país. Pero bueno, nosotros te agradecemos enormemente tu presencia, aún virtual, tus movimientos, tus manos, tu puño, reflejan esa pasionalidad de las cosas que estamos hablando. Y yo también creo que estos espacios de pensamiento, aún en este estado de pantalla, etcétera, nos brinda la posibilidad de pensar, de repensar cosas, de cotejar opciones y bueno, tenemos varios de nuestros oradores y disertantes de este espacio que van trayendo ideas y que a uno lo mueven, lo afectan, ¿no? Te producen esa vibratilidad de la que habla Sueli Rolnik, ¿no? Y bueno, me parece que sí, que son espacios de micropolítica. Y te agradecemos enormemente tus ideas y tu estímulo a seguir pensando.
Muchísimas gracias, ha sido un placer, Judith, muchísimas gracias.
Un aplauso. Bueno, nos vemos en la próxima. La conferencia va a estar en YouTube y vamos a tratar de mandar también algo de la traducción, ¿sí? A todos ustedes. Chao, hasta pronto. Y bueno, nos despedimos. Gonzalo. Francisco.